Section 9 of Reclaiming Revolution. History, Summation, and Lessons from the Work of STORM, Standing Together to Organize a Revolutionary Movement. This recording is in the public domain. Recorded by the Progressing America Project. Reclaiming Revolution, Section 9. 2001 to 2003, Crisis and Disillusion. Towards the end of 2000, General members started to express concern that core members were not politically developed enough to fulfill their constitutional obligation to lead the organization ideologically. When one of the founders, a leading member within the core, went on leave from the organization, concerns about the core's ability to lead the group intensified within both the core and the general membership. His absence left a noticeable leadership vacuum that would be difficult to fill. Ultimately, the organization was not able to respond to the challenges of this period. 2001 to 2003 was a time of crisis from which STORM never emerged. External criticisms bring internal tensions to the forefront. Internal tensions within STORM began to come into sharp relief when the group faced critical feedback from youth organizations with which we had worked in the campaign to defeat Proposition 21. Many activists and organizations in the youth and student movement were crushed when, despite their valiant efforts, California voters approved Proposition 21. Their post-election evaluations surfaced concerns about STORM members' prominent role in the campaign. STORM members had played leading roles in many of the key organizations in the fight. In the next few months, representatives of 6 leading youth organizations met to discuss STORM's role in the movement and to plan a feedback session for STORM. They identified ways in which STORM members had helped the growth of the youth movement, such as bringing and building skills, helping found organizations, supporting young activists as they worked and learned. They also highlighted problems with STORM's participation, STORM's lack of transparency, the lack of clear feedback mechanisms for other organizations, that STORM had internal conversations that then had outside impacts on the movement. These criticisms were very similar to those that STORM had made of itself in its own evaluations. Still, members often felt frustrated and confused by both the content of the criticisms and the way they were communicated. STORM's general members had been the most deeply involved in the youth work. They bore the brunt of the criticism and were the most hurt by them. The stress and emotional hurt coming out of these meetings with other groups heightened the organization's frustration, especially among general members, with STORM's internal issues of leadership, democracy, lack of strategy, theoretical underdevelopment, demanding organizational culture, and poor practice in the movement. The core tries to respond. The general members demanded that the core develop answers. In response, the core began an internal planning process to help the group address its internal issues. But almost as soon as that process began, another crisis erupted that diverted the core's attention. A series of romantic relationships involving a few members of the organization, including one active core member and the core member who had just gone on leave, turned into a major crisis for the organization. The on-leave core member made his leave permanent. This crisis caused tensions between some core members. When it returned to its efforts to develop a plan for the group, the core eventually agreed that STORM faced 2 main problems: the lack of an adequate strategy framework and members' need to develop a better practice in their mass work. But the core could not agree on how to address these problems. Some in the core thought that the group should prioritize theoretical study. Others thought that the group should prioritize reflection on the engagement in mass work during this difficult period. The core was also divided over whether the group should begin to develop a more comprehensive strategy by studying materialist dialectics or by studying historical revolutionary strategies. The gridlock, uncharacteristic for a core that had always been able to work through its differences, was a reflection of both political differences over the organization's direction and the interpersonal differences that had developed during the most recent crisis. Dissension. The core was not the only grouping talking about these problems. Many general members were starting to raise concerns, but different members dealt with their concerns differently. Several members, primarily from the general membership, began to meet outside of the organizational meetings to discuss their growing critiques of the group. A former member who had significant criticisms of the group influenced these conversations. These critiques revolved primarily around concerns about Storm's method of work and problematic culture. These members placed responsibility for these problems on the core, and particularly on the worker organizations in the core, because they believed that the core had modeled the problems in Storm's method of work. They also didn't think that the core was taking Storm's internal problems seriously enough. The core, they thought, was out of touch with the majority of the general membership. These members explicitly decided not to communicate their critiques directly, either with the members they were critiquing or with the membership as a whole. This decision, a violation of the organization's codes of conduct, made dialogue and resolution difficult. These various conflicts, some open and some latent, among different members and groups of members, led to a growing climate of frustration, factionalism, and distrust in the organization. This made it nearly impossible for us to successfully resolve the group's internal challenges. The January 2001 Organizational Advance. These critiques and tensions became more apparent as Storm started to plan for its January 2001 organizational advance. The Advance Planning Committee included core and general members. Core members on both sides of the intra-core conflict were on the committee, as were several of the general members who were raising the strongest critiques. The committee discussed many of the concerns and criticisms that were coming up at all levels of the organization. They developed an agenda that would walk the entire group through a collective process of assessing Storm's line and strategy, our program, our organizational culture and practice, and our organizational structure. During this advance, the membership agreed that Storm needed to make some radical changes in order to fully address the challenges we were facing.